Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and I just want to ask some questions. Just simple. Want to keep it simple? Ask some questions about the US election. So these are my sort of top 10 kind of things that I'm kind of curious about, about with the last US election. And I'm just going to read them off and say, hey, these are my questions. I'm putting them out there. And I'm just curious because it seems like there's some questions that we should be asking about the US election that nobody seems to be asking. And here's my major questions. First one is the Dominion software. We know that the Dominion software has actually connections to the Clinton Foundation and Clintons themselves. And it was used in 30 states. And in one situation, they found that it had accidentally flipped 6,000 votes for Trump over to Biden. Now, this was discovered, and they actually were able to reverse that flip and actually give those votes back to Trump. But the question I have, simple question, is did this happen in anywhere else? Did they just miss it? Maybe it happened in other locations, and it's used in like 30 states. So there's some questions there that just if it happened once, maybe it could happen again. So just a simple question. The next one was the dead registrations. Now, Fleckis Talks and myself, I also did a video on this. You can check it out. I'll put a link in my description. I checked. There's about 7,000 people that were registered to vote in Michigan. Now, and my question here is, were any of these people able to vote? Did these registrations actually result in these people being able to vote? And well, if they were able to vote, who was it that was actually doing the voting? And because if they're dead, I hope that they didn't rise from their graves and vote. Maybe if they did, then maybe it's more legitimate. But who did the voting, and who registered these people? Many of the names that were on the list were dead people, dead many years ago, like 20, maybe 30, even 50 years ago. So the question is, who registered these people? Usually they purge the voter rolls every so often, so dead people can't be registered to vote. So the next one is mail-in ballots. Now, mail-in ballots typically have a failure rate of around 2%. And that is actually in the situation where it's when people request a ballot. So, for example, traditionally people would request a ballot, like let's say they're overseas or in the military, or they're just not in a position where they can vote on election day. And what they can do is they can do like absentee voting, and they can basically request a vote. And even in those cases where they request a vote and they receive the ballot and then they sort it all out, there's still a failure rate of around 2%. Well, in this election, where we had basically ballots that were sent out to random, like not just random people, but sent out to all registered voters, where in theory, that these ballots are going out and people could pick them up. People, like there was cases of employees, postal employees basically gathering votes and people not receiving their ballots, and a whole bunch of weird things happening with mail-in ballots. Well, you would expect the failure rate to be much higher when it's not such a controlled situation. So why is it that according to the stats of this last election, that the failure rate was like 1/30th of what you would expect to be 2% or higher failure rate of mail-in balloting? So just a question, just a curiosity. Why was the mail-in voting so successful this time when you would expect the complete opposite? So another thing is they reports of people who were getting multiple copies of mail-in ballots. Like there was this one woman who claimed to have received 7 copies of the mail-in ballots. And when she went to vote, though, they said that she had already voted. So she actually wanted to vote in person, but when she did so, they said, well, you've already voted. So there's a little bit of weirdness there. And this is, again, with mail-in ballots, it's just sort of what's going on. Can people be voting who are not necessarily the people who should be, the one actually voting? So issues with mail-in ballots. Another thing one more point with mail-in ballots is, according to the process, the way that these ballots are set up, is you're supposed to have a witness to make sure that you are the person who actually is on the ballot, that's the right person to be voting. And you got to get a witness to say that this is the case. And that witness has to fill in the address of their address. So you have the person that voted, you have the witness and the witness's address all on the ballot, so that you know that it's probably more legitimate, because there's somebody that's putting their name as well to it, that they confirm that this is a real ballot, and everything is real, legitimate. And I've heard cases where all these other things, the witnessing and the address for the witness, were not actually on the ballots. Well, how many of those mail-in ballots had this being an issue, where they weren't completely filled out correctly? And I've heard reports of this happening where, they figure actually as many as like 600,000 ballots had this weird issue. I think I might be misquoting on that. You can check it. But the point is, there was a lot of votes where this could have been the case, where it wasn't completed correctly. The next thing was the 4 o'clock voter dump, vote dump, where I'm a night owl. I work really long hours. I was up till like 4 in the morning and watching the election. It was kind of cool. It looked like Trump was going to have a sure win. And all of a sudden I was like, I'm getting tired. I should probably go to sleep. And they said, they're stopped counting voting anyways. So, hey, might as well go to sleep. But, I was so excited that I actually woke up like an hour later. I just was so excited. I wanted to check the numbers. And I woke up an hour later, and Michigan and Wisconsin both flipped like over a very short time, where there was 130,000 votes in Michigan, which sort of pushed Biden up. And all of a sudden, Biden looked like he was going to win Michigan. So why is it that there was this 130,000 votes, all for Biden, that sort of magically appeared when they supposedly were stopped counting voting? Now, I've heard people say, well, they actually didn't stop vote counting, but they just wanted to, count the votes in peace without having all these people kind of watching them and monitoring them. But then that would raise another question, is why would they want to do that? Why would people watching the vote affect the vote themselves? So it seems like a really weird case where there's just this magic number that just happened to give Biden enough votes so that he could flip the state blue instead of letting it be a win for Trump. So just a question, where these votes come from and what happened there. Another question that I have is Pennsylvania voting irregularities. So one of the things that happened in Pennsylvania was the governor there, she sent out the ballots where the date was already previously, it was already associated, it was already on the ballot. So you could actually submit the ballot today, which is many days after the election, but it would be already pre-stamped with the election date on it, or previous pre-election date on it, so that it would look like it was submitted before the election. And the postal office wouldn't stamp it because it's already been stamped with that date. So how many votes were impacted by this, where they could have been voting after the election was over, and and just the election people kept on counting it, thinking that they were sent before the election was over. So how many ballots did that impact? And that's a reasonable question, I hope. So it just seems like some kind of weird things going on there. Now, number 6 of my list of many questions to ask would be, there was this claim by Project Veritas where they basically were interviewing a postal worker in Michigan. And he was basically saying that he was told to backdate ballots. So he was basically told that the policy was that they had to backdate ballots so ballots would be counted. And he thought this was a little bit strange. So he actually, basically came forward as a whistleblower and said, hey, look, there's some kind of weird stuff going on here where they're telling me to backdate ballots in order to have them, be considered valid. And that was kind of a weird thing. So whatever happened to these ballots, how many ballots were impacted by this kind of action? And was it just one post office that did this policy and just happened to have that one whistleblower that kind of said that this was going on? Or did it happen in other locations and just nobody came forward to say, hey, we're doing this too? So why, what's going on there? Just curious. It just seems like something that should be investigated. Nobody seems to be going out to investigate it, and nobody seems to be questioning about how many ballots were maybe impacted by it. So just curious. The next one is the poll watchers. So again, I think it happened in a few locations. Poll watchers were told because of COVID, people were really, really paranoid about COVID, that they had to stand back 20 feet from watching the poll. So what a poll watcher does is just make sure that, and it's nonpartisan. So there's like a poll watcher that represents the Republican Party. There's a poll watcher that represents the Democrat Party, and independent poll watcher. And they all basically watch to make sure that the ballots are being counted correctly. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing for democracy to basically make sure that the ballots are being counted correctly and for the right people. Makes sense. But these poll watchers were told to stand back 20 feet. And if you stand back 20 feet, there's no way that you can actually do your duty of checking to make sure that they're actually counting the ballots correctly. So they actually had to do, like the Trump team actually had to take legal action in order to make sure that these poll watchers could stand within 6 feet so that they could properly monitor the counting process. And the question would be, how many votes were counted when there was no way to properly monitor those counts of votes? So, and what was the impact of that? And were there any irregularities that happened during that point where they weren't able to properly monitor the counting process? So just some reasonable questions, I hope. Just some questions I have. The next one is about out-of-state voters. Now, this has been a claim by the Trump legal team, and it's also been something that's been put forward by the different municipalities in the U.S., where people were voting outside of their state. So it can happen where you vote, where people vote because they moved, or they are not available at home to vote, and they are voting, or they recently moved and they vote based on their past address because it just wasn't within that time frame to vote in their new address. It could happen. So the point is, how many of these out-of-state voters will have their votes dismissed because of the fact that they're voting uh, in the wrong state. And that can happen, like even legitimately it can happen where people's votes will not be counted because they shouldn't be voting in the state that they voted in. And it does happen. It happens in every election, and it's something that raises questions. And there are issues where you can have people being pulled into a location just to get the votes for that location, and so it can be a source of voter fraud where people can be voting in the wrong location. You can swing a vote based on you pulling people that maybe Californians, bring them into Georgia or something where they're voting, you know, more for their side to, swing the vote. So that's just kind of a weird question. So the other thing that I have is the Benford's Law. Benford basically was a statistician, and he basically looked at not just, there was like sort of like record keeping, bookkeeping, and he looked at probabilities within that and how natural numbers appear. So, for example, when you write your ledgers in accounting, one of the things you can do is kind of cook the books, where you make it look like you have more money or less money than you really do have. And if people do that, they kind of do it where it's statistically incorrect, where it's not what it should be. And what happens is they do it not intentionally to make it obvious, but it's obvious to a statistician that there's some weirdness going on. And what you can see, there's actually sort of a pattern to how numbers actually naturally appear. That usually the first number in like any tally is a 1. And then you expect the second digit in that number to be a certain number, and so forth. And the least common digit within those order is a 9. Okay, so you'd see sort of like a pattern. Well, if you look at the swing states in the US, the voter pattern kind of for Trump looks like it fits the Benford's Law. And actually, nationally, it looks like overall the votes kind of fit Benford's Law. However, in the swing states specifically, there's actually a huge skew where they do not fit the Benford's Law for the Democrats. It is completely not natural the way the numbers appear for the Democrats. And it's just a question, what's going on there? Because that's not statistically normal. And typically, Benford's Law is pretty good at predicting malfeasance. And, it's just a question, what's going on there? Is this a sign of potential voter fraud? And maybe it isn't. Maybe it's just, weirdness in the numbers that somehow randomly they don't follow the random patterns that normally they would. But the question is, why didn't they follow Benford's Law? And it's a very good sniff test for whether there's voter fraud or not. So just a question. I'll actually link to a really good video where a statistician goes through the numbers, and he shows how the Democrats failed in the swing states to really meet the scrutiny for logistic truth. So the next one is my last question was about Joe Biden himself. Now, Joe Biden, he said something that was kind of interesting to me. He said the following, and I'm going to quote him exactly what he said. We put together, I think, the most extensive and inclusive voter fraud organization. Okay? So, I mean, it's kind of a weird thing to say that he said this. I mean, Joe Biden's kind of having many of those senior moments and maybe moments of dementia. So, maybe he just misspoke. I'm not sure why he used the word fraud in his misspeak. Maybe he was just saying the quiet part loud, and and you know, it's just a question. What did he mean when he said that? Now, why didn't anybody investigate what he meant when he said that? Did he misspeak? Just ask him on it. Just a simple question. So these are my questions that I'd like to hear some good answers to. And if you feel like you have good answers to these questions, please put a comment down below and give me these, some of the questions that I have about the US election, and give me some good answers, because I'd love to hear them, because at this point, I'm kind of stumped. What's going on here? So thanks for watching. Bye for now.